Thank you. Kia ora e hoa. And thanks to the people who've worked hard to make this this day happen. So I'm just going to briefly talk, very briefly, about I guess another way forward around family violence. And the thing is that there's the whole thinking around family violence, certainly, you know, in any area that's had any power in the system, has been around the patriarchal power and control model. And it seems that there's been a drive to try and establish that even more firmly as the way to understand domestic violence. Amy Adams' review, the discussion document associated with that, called, as other groups have called, to adopt an agreed upon understanding of family violence, and that understanding is all around the Duluth model. Some of the suggested approaches in that document were quite reasonable, but I actually suggest that they'll only be effective if they're not based on the Duluth model, the patriarchal power and control model. It was never a model derived from good research and has largely been refuted by any good research that's happened. Factors such as, you know, substance abuse, addictions, mental illness, personality disorder, head injury, emotional trauma history, relationship conflict, poor communication skills and various forms of violence or provocation from both parties, they've all been shown to be primarily causal. And of course, you know, violent situations, there's a wide range of factors involved with them. And really, a realistic understanding of those kinds of issues will be necessary if any shared understanding is going to be helpful. That model's also been the basis of the sort of violence prevention programs, or probably not as much nowadays, but it's still a big part of them. And yet, programs based on that model have been found to be pretty useless, quite frankly. There was a literature review done in 2011, for example, and it found that as the Duluth model programs are subjected to increasingly rigorous review, their success rate approaches 0. Okay, and one report after another has come out over the last decade or two on family violence and intimate partner violence, and they all seem to start with the assumption that it's the power and control model, and then they only look at things in ways that are going to support that. And even the data they get, they then process the data in ways to keep on supporting that model. And one example of that was the Family Violence Deaths Review Committee, which also emphasises male power and control as some sort of fundamental cause of family violence. I'm not saying it never is, but I think it's a very small proportion of cases where that's actually an accurate representation of what's going on, maybe 5% in my experience. And even if it is an accurate representation of what's going on, it doesn't actually provide a very useful way to address it anyway, by acknowledging that. So the Family Violence Death Review Committee, they stated things like coercive control rather than physical force as a defining feature of the abuse. And they're talking about making coercive control an offence, and fair enough, there might be some merit in that, but doing that on the basis that is somehow the fundamental cause of a significant amount or a substantial amount of family violence is erroneous. They state things like strategies are designed to control the victim even when she is not in the presence of an abusive ex-partner, and note they always use the gender-specific terminology, implying that, you know, only men are ever perpetrators and only women are ever victims. And I actually want to support something said before, that actually the whole notion in most cases of intimate partner violence, the whole notion of deciding that one person is an aggressor and the other is a victim is erroneous as well, and isn't helpful, however. Okay, the Family Violence Deaths Committee, Review Committee, we're pushing this idea that the power and control model is the important one, and we're also wanting that to become a shared understanding. But unfortunately, their data was a bit inconvenient about that, because about a quarter of intimate partner homicides are suffered by men and committed by women. And that's a little hard to explain through the Duluth patriarchal power and control model. As well as there's other research showing, for example, that lesbian relationships are even more violent on average than heterosexual relationships. And so those things don't really fit with that model, do they? So what the Family Violence Deaths Review Committee did to deal with that was they invented the idea of primary victim and primary aggressor. And they used what are basically quite spurious criteria for deciding that people had been either a primary victim or a primary aggressor. And hey presto, they came up with that all the male victims, homicide victims by females, were all actually primary aggressors. And all the female murderers were actually primary victims on their criteria. I don't have time to go into the criteria, but if you actually have a look at the criteria they used, they really are nonsense. For example, if there had been a protection order or a police safety order, then they decided that meant that person who had that applied was the primary aggressor. But of course, those orders don't prove anything. They don't have to have any evidential basis, particularly. They don't really prove that that anyone was an aggressor. They're just an order that was made based on somebody's story. There's no evidential requirement. There's no proof. There's no trial. You can't determine fault on the basis of those. Okay, a much more valid and useful model for understanding most intimate partner violence and family violence also is in the emotionally focused therapy model that Dr. Susan Johnson developed. This model identifies emotional threat experienced by each party, and this is in line, I think, with the shame thing that you were talking about, Warwick, and also some of the stuff, some of the other stuff that's come up today. So basically, people tend to become most emotionally threatened by the people who are most important to them, who mean the most to them. And if they behave in a way that's inconsistent with their expectation or idea of a reliable attachment figure, then this is emotionally threatening. And then there will be a defensive reaction, and both parties then react similarly. So for example, one partner might start complaining and criticising the other partner, and because that partner feels threatened by the behaviour of the other partner, right? And then the other partner feels emotionally threatened by being not valued and criticised and complained at often by their partner. And this becomes a vicious cycle, and it spins stronger and stronger, and that can lead to violence. There have been programs done in New Zealand by New Zealand Police domestic violence personnel in Taumarunui and Wellington, and they've achieved, they properly researched the outcome, and they achieved really impressive results where they took people in who there'd been a long history of repeat offences and domestic violence incidents, and that they brought them in, and after their program, those people reduced their violence and significantly. I can't remember, but something like 60% or something. It was really quite significant. And they used a model that, although they didn't attribute it to the emotionally focused model, they used principles in line with that model. They took in couples who'd been the subject to numerous police call-outs and offences to a weekend retreat, working with the couples both together and separately, They recognised the extent to which violence was mutual, if it was, and we know that in most cases it is. There's mutual violence. We know that from both the Christchurch and Dunedin longitudinal studies, for example, but also lots of other international research. And they worked on the contribution of both parties to the violent incidents and developed, and having both parties take responsible for their relationship behaviour. Now, you know, obviously if one party had been a lot more violent than the other, they have to take responsibility. They were held responsible for that. But they also took a more sort of realistic and holistic approach to it. And they worked. So, the final thing I want to say, because so little time, is that one of the most dangerous developments, I think, resulting at the moment from this misguided idea that power and control, they talk about power and control now, but really it's all basically meant to be patriarchal power and control. One of the dangerous developments at the moment is that they're pushing for to change the law to condone or partially condone the killing of men by women, male partners by females, on the basis of a claimed slow burn provocation, and that, you know, women who claim to be subjected to violence have no option but to kill their partner as he lies in bed asleep, or stab him in the back when he's in the shower. And these things happen. That's how it happens. It's an adaptation of the battered woman syndrome, I guess, which has never really been formally accepted because the research hasn't really supported it. Obviously, you know, people can become pretty disabled by being in violent situations, but really, you know, I think I'd like people to be alert for this idea that there's going to be some kind of shared understanding of domestic violence and labelling it in terms of a power and control model, and B, I'd like people to be alert for this idea of reducing the culpability of people who kill their partners on the slow burn provocation idea. I think it's a very dangerous thing. Anyway, thank you. That'll be enough for me, and then my colleague Kerry's going to share the week time slot.
It's good to have Hans Levan, the most male-friendly psychologist in New Zealand. I'm serious, Hans. I'm serious, and it does need to be announced. Yeah, because over the last 20 years or so, I've become increasingly disturbed about this kind of male persecution, I think is the right word, that has been accumulating. And I'd just like to say g'day to Warwick. It's nice to link up there. Warwick helped train me when I was at Men's Line 20 years ago.
Oh, so you're responsible.
And thanks to Donald here at Christchurch. This is a very important initiative, and I thought, yes, I want to be here. Thank you. And what you've been saying rings true too. But anyway, what I wanted to say was, I didn't get time for a professional sign either, because I've done it for ages and time. You need to realise that unfortunately I think we've reached a very disturbing place in Western society, not just in New Zealand and not just in Christchurch, but males increasingly are becoming an endangered species. I have felt threatened. I'm a grandfather, I'm a graduate and a survivor. I'm lucky to be standing here also. And I think in the end this is what's driven me to continue for so many years. And until we rectify that, I actually think Western civilization, by the way that it's treated males, I don't think there's much doubt about it when I talk to people. It's all going down, and it does need to be rectified. And there are serious implications for politicians who have the balls to stand up and try to do something about it. Anyway, and recently I was involved with a group of guys, and we made representations to the Human Rights Commission, because it is a human rights issue. And we got a good hearing from the new Commissioner, David Rutherford. He seemed a very amiable, open-minded, sensible man, and so we're going to continue to dialogue with him. and become part of the independent periodic review in the United Nations. Because if you look through the last periodic review, there's no concerns about the welfare of males at all. There's nothing there. So we're going to make sure that there's something in the next one. And there are various other avenues that we intend to explore, because apart from my background in men's support earlier, I have now come to realise that things are going to have to change politically, and the law is going to be changed. So this means political action. So in recent years I'm pretty proud of some of the political action that I've done to try and get what you might call real gender equality as opposed to mock equality. And so I think probably the fastest way to use this time to the best advantage is I'd like to read you some sections from my submission. The 7 or 8 of us made submissions to the Human Rights Commission, but this quickly puts it in context. So I'll just read this to you, but I think this summarises where it's really at. New Zealand's government was the first to grant women a vote. Women have benefited from greater education, management roles, political leadership, support as mothers, and empowerment of their rights with affirmative action. This powerful change was engineered by feminists through their organisations to secure a legitimate place in wider society based on gender equality. In the last 2 decades, the Ministry for Women, formerly the Ministry for Women's Affairs, has championed women's welfare with taxpayer funding of over $100 million. I say that fairly powerfully because does any such organ exist for men? And men's welfare essentially has had zilch. That is a massive contradiction. The gender balance of rights and welfare has now altered. Women's interests have been advanced at the expense of men's rights and welfare, notably on social and family issues. Resultant family devastation and social dysfunction is regularly reported. Formerly, men were valued as pioneers, developers, protectors, providers, mentors and fathers. Now the abuse of males is commonplace, often portrayed as responsible for societal ills. Men's difficulties and complaints on gender issues are ignored. This distortion of social reality has prompted male denigration and abuse of men's rights. Suffering, violence, ruin, murder, depression and high male suicide are manifest. Fatherless children become hapless victims in such a destructive dynamic. Gender abuse of males is founded in underlying attitudes, social policy and sexist law. The Victorian attitude of the Titanic syndrome discounts men and considers women and children more important. Feminism places female priorities as paramount, often more pressing than male interests. White knights betray the welfare of their own gender to champion women's rights as a noble cause. These misguided intentions and doubtful rewards combine to wreak havoc on the welfare of males now seen. Unfortunately, these policies have become entrenched in law. A real challenge lays before all New Zealanders, their governments, those concerned with the governance of human rights and other organs of administration. The discrimination against males dissipates the human resource of half the population. Affirmative action for males is required to develop real gender equality. Compassion and commitment will be required of all to address this significant gender issue. So that sort of puts it in a nutshell. That's how I feel about it. And as I move around, when I say these sorts of things, increasingly, there has been a shift in opinion. I don't get too much disagreement anymore as I used to get 20 years ago. And now it's great to have women like Louise here, who are now speaking out and who realise that their welfare is interlocked with the welfare of men. If you don't look after men, women and children suffer also. It's holistic, it's all in together. And so, before I take too much talk, but in my submission I go through about 12 major breaches of human rights of greater and lesser extent. And so the major abuses of particular human rights, these are abuses of the Human Rights Declaration, which we're a signatory to. Some of them are serious, others are minor. But by the time you fit the whole 12 or 15 abuses together, it is a massive put down on males. And no wonder we've now got the highest male suicide rate, as far as we can tell, in the Western world. Right here in little old God's own. And really, until we bring social and policy and law into a more balanced perspective by bringing males and men and the welfare of boys to the political table, then we're not going to make much progress, because you're only dealing with half of the deal, half of the population. So this is why I've become an ardent advocate for the need for a ministry for men. Yay. How on earth can you develop social policy and law change which is balanced and reasonable and sensible and founded on research and insight? How can you do that if you've only got half the population at the table? We need to have a ministry for men, and with $100 million spent for women's welfare, that's great. I'm pleased they got it. But what about us? It's time to get real at the political level, and I would suggest to Kelvin that if the Labour Party had the balls to actually propose that a ministry for men should be instituted and properly funded, many of the working class men, and my grandfather used to go to meetings at Blackball on the West Coast. I walked from the Labour Party years ago because of this developing persecution of men. And until something's done at the political level, then all of these wonderful people here, and I've done it too, who drive the ambulance around at the bottom of the cliff and mop up the blood, well, I got sick of that. I wanted to get up the top and build the fence to stop the bodies falling down the cliff. I want the law changed. I want the awareness raised. I want politicians to stand up in the House and talk about the lack of role models in schools for boys. How do they learn to be a man? There's no male teachers in much of education. Where are they? And I do have a qualification. I have 2 degrees in education actually, but I walked years ago to various other jobs, and I ended up doing this sort of stuff. And as you can probably gather, I feel this with a real passion, and I believe our society is becoming increasingly dysfunctional. Our families are devastated, men are suffering, boys are going to suffer even more on it in the future. And this is why being here is so important. And thanks for the opportunity to say something like this. And I think this is a very important initiative, and I hope that politicians will get the message and they will develop the courage to do something about it, because we do need a ministry for men, and we need several $1 million just to kick it off.
10 will do.
10 million? Yeah, we can get rid of 10 million easy. Okay. Yeah, so thanks.
Got your bickies, bro.
All right.